Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Teen uh, Leap Newcomer Housing Task Group Learning Series Session 1, Untangling the Language of Housing Crisis. So my name is I'm Isabella Yan from Toronto North Local Immigration Partnership. I'm the lead for the Settlement and Language Working Group. I'm based at Working Women Community Center. So this session is the very first session of the housing series. It is tailored for the frontline staff in the sector, including housing worker, settlement worker, mental health worker, youth worker, and others, to better understand the key housing terms and concepts commonly used in Canada. This session will build your confidence in explaining the rental processes, housing types, and the tenants' rights. So a note for everybody, so this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to TeenLeap YouTube channel. And first, let me start our session by acknowledging that the land on which we are situated is the traditional land of Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Belt Covenant, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So as TeenLeap, we are committed to advancing reconciliation with indigenous peoples in the work we do, specifically in the settlement sector. Through continued learning, engagement, and collaboration, we strive to build a more meaningful partnership between Indigenous and newcomer communities for generations to come. So now I'd like to start with the quick agenda. We'll start with introducing our presenter, our guest speaker, Rebecca Ward, and she will present around 45 minutes. After that, we're going to have a Q&A and a feedback form and closing. So now this is our guest speaker, Rebecca Ward. Rebecca Ward is a housing lawyer who works at Willowdale Community Legal Services. She assists individuals who are seeking legal advice about their rights and responsibilities as tenants. And she represents tenants who are facing legal proceedings at the landlord and tenant board. Rebecca, the floor is yours. I stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I'm just going to now share my screen. Okay. So, hi everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm looking forward to hopefully chatting a lot with many of you. Hopefully this isn't just me speaking at you, but hopefully we can have a conversation today. I just want to start out by introducing myself. So, as Isabella just said, I'm a housing lawyer at Willowdale Community Legal Services. For those of you who are not familiar with the legal clinic system in Toronto, just briefly, there are legal clinics all across the province, and we provide free legal services to people in different areas of the law, mainly housing, immigration, and social assistance or income maintenance, things like ODSP and OW. We provide free legal services to folks if they live in our catchment area and they meet our financial eligibility criteria. And we're funded through Legal Aid Ontario. So if folks contact our clinic and they need legal services and they don't live in our area, we're able to refer them elsewhere to their local legal clinic. The legal clinics do a lot of really, really great work with providing legal services to individuals in our neighborhoods. So I work at Willowdale. We're in the northeast, North York part of the city, but there are other legal clinics all across the area. So I know Isabella just kind of centered us with a land acknowledgement of what land we are on, traditionally who has cared for this land and worked on and lived on this land. I just wanted to highlight a couple of points that maybe can help kind of ground us before we head into our conversation about housing. Because we know that Canada is a settler colony, and we know that that means that the people who are a part of the nations that have lived here for many, many years before settlers came are still feeling the effects of colonialism. And so today we're talking about housing, the issue of housing and colonialism. They're inextricably related. They're very, very related. And so I wanted to draw out just a couple of stats here to highlight for us the reality of how colonialism is still shaping access to housing. So in the 2021 Canadian census, Indigenous people were almost three times more likely to live in a dwelling that was in need of major repairs than the non-Indigenous population. So we know that 16.4% versus 5.7%. Further, Indigenous people were almost twice as likely to live in crowded housing compared to the non-Indigenous population. That's just over 17% versus 9.4%. So colonialism, um, the effects of Canada being a settler colony are not over. Colonialism isn't over. It is still very much alive and active in Canada. And it's important for us as providers of services for people who are trying to access housing, who are having difficulty with housing, to remind ourselves of the colonial context in which we're existing and operating as people in Canada. So I want to start out here just giving us a bit of an agenda of where we're headed over the next 45 minutes to an hour. Um, I want to also just kind of outline what we're not going to be talking about. So today is about, grounding ourselves in the language, how we talk about housing, what words our clients or other service providers might be using when it comes to housing, what kind of terms we should be aware of. But I'm not going to be talking to you about some things. So I just want to kind of set that out so that our expectations are clear. So I'm not going to be talking about the programs that exist for affordable housing in any detail. I'll touch on some, but I'm not going to be comprehensively talking about all of them. I'm not going to be talking about how we fix the housing problems that we're seeing, although that might kind of come up in the conversation. I'm not going to be talking about real estate and home ownership. That's not my area of expertise. I work in tenancy law that deals with renters, so situations where there's a landlord and a tenant who's renting from the landlord, not situations of real estate ownership or buying or selling property. So today we're orienting ourselves in how to talk about residential tenancies. So first, I want to just start with the question of, can we even call this a housing crisis? I know that the title of this presentation is Untangling the Language of the Housing Crisis, but I want to just first talk about what it means for something to be a crisis. Then we're going to get into affordable housing, which is going to be the first big chunk of this presentation. What does it mean when somebody refers to something as affordable housing? What does it mean for housing to be affordable? We're going to look at some different examples of affordable housing. And then the second half of the presentation, going to be talking about some other housing terms to know. There are some terms that you might hear your clients using or you might see in paperwork with your clients that's helpful for you to know what the acronyms are talking about or what the terms mean. And then the final part of the presentation, I just want to kind of bring you guys into the loop onto some law reform efforts that are happening right now, some really exciting new changes to the law that affect residential tenancies. So, like I said, the name of this presentation is Untangling the Language of the Housing Crisis. And oftentimes, especially in Toronto, we hear people talking about the crisis, the housing crisis. That's often how we, as service providers who do housing type work, kind of think of the context that we're in. But I wanted to share this quote from this really wonderful book called The Tenant Class that says, a housing system that serves all but one group is not in a state of crisis. It is one based on structural inequality and economic exploitation. So I wanted to present this quote and just kind of start out briefly by talking about, how are we even thinking about what's happening right now in Toronto or across Ontario? A crisis implies that there's, something infrequent, something has suddenly been brought about that's having really dire consequences for people unless it's brought under control. The reality, though, is that there have been calls for systemic reform related to housing in Canada for decades and decades and decades. The issues that we've seen about lack of access to affordable housing have existed for a very long time. The issues that we're seeing now are not new. There might be certain conditions that are exacerbating them, but they're not new. They've existed for a very long time. And so when we question whether it's a crisis, it's not because what we're seeing isn't severe. I imagine many of you, as with myself, see people dealing with crisis. They are dealing with lack of access to safe, affordable housing. We all know that there are dire consequences that are happening right now because of people's lack of access to affordable housing. But referring to it as a crisis might imply that this is not a state of affairs that's actually existed for a long time and is actually the result of government policy decisions. In reality, the housing conditions that our clients are living in right now are a result of government policy decisions that have been made for years. And so I guess I just want to make sure that we, as people who are providing services to people who are struggling with finding safe, affordable housing for their families, I want to ensure that we understand that these issues that our clients are facing, that we're seeing our clients deal with, they've existed for decades and they exist because of government policy decisions. They are not inevitable, they are fixable decisions. But these problems are going to continue unless governments take different actions. So I know in this housing series, there are going to be other presentations that will focus more on solutions. And I think that presentation is going to be much more the opportunity to talk about what government changes need to happen, what policy changes need to happen in order for the housing crisis to no longer be a crisis. Today, we're not getting there yet, but I just want us to remember that everything that our clients are facing is a result of government decisions. They're not inevitable results of just living in Canada. Conditions can be different and they should be different. So, okay, so let's start out. I know there's many of us in this chat. We don't have a poll function set up, but I'm hoping people can just share in the chat what they think the answer to this question is. So the question is, what is affordable housing? We often hear people talk about it. What is the actual definition of affordable housing? Is it A, housing that is provided by the government? Is it B, housing that costs a household 45% or less of their total income? Is it C, housing that Doug Ford could afford as a 25-year-old? Or is it D, housing that costs a household 30% or less of total income? So I'm seeing lots of answers of D and also C in the chat. Okay, great. Anybody want to suggest any other possible answers? For those who are curious, or who don't know, Doug Ford was only 25 years old in 1989. And so a bachelor apartment, just this is kind of just like a trivia factoid here. A bachelor apartment in Toronto in 1989 was about the average rent was about $450 monthly, which is just wild to me to think about only paying $450 for an apartment. But if Doug Ford was wanting a bachelor apartment in Toronto when he was 25, he would have only had to pay $450. And so, okay, so we're seeing lots of C, but mostly D. Sounds like everybody here is already pretty plugged into what affordable housing definitions are because the correct answer is D. I mean, I think the question is a bit tough because I think in a sense, answer A, which is housing that is provided by a government, could be considered affordable. Answer C, housing that Doug Ford could afford as a 25-year-old, could be considered affordable because if, paying $450 for an apartment now, that I think that would be considered affordable for a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people. But the typical method for measuring affordable housing, everybody who answered D is correct. It's called the shelter cost income ratio. So housing is considered affordable if it costs 30% or less of before tax household income. So affordability, when we're thinking about affordability, it's not some objective number. It's about comparing what portion of somebody's income is being spent on their rent. So if we know it's 30%, unfortunately, recent data tells us that most people don't live in affordable housing. So some data from last year reveals that across Canada, only about 36% of renters pay 30% or less of their income on housing. 37%, the majority of people spend between 31 and 50% of their income on housing. And the final 16% spend more than 50% of their income on rental housing. So we know that if this is the definition, if 30% of your income should only be spent on rent as a renter to make it affordable, we know that the majority of Canadian renters are not living in affordable housing. Now, different people will say affordable housing and mean different things. And so today I want to talk about first grounding ourselves in that definition of 30%. That's the commonly understood definition of affordable housing, but also touch on some other definitions we hear. So unfortunately, the City of Toronto has a different definition of affordable. They don't go by the 30% of your income being spent on rent as affordable. They're basing it off of average market rent. So the City of Toronto will consider a home affordable if the rental rate is offered at or below average market rent in that area. So for some people, this could be 30% of their income, but for many people, it probably isn't. The calculation that the City of Toronto is doing is not about each individual household's income and how the rent relates to that. Rather, the calculation is about the average rent in the area. And we know, as those of us who live in Toronto, many of the average rents throughout Toronto are sky high. And so considering average market rent as the marker of affordability really misses the essential part of considering affordability, which is how the rent relates to your household income. If we look even closer at the City of Toronto definition of affordability, um, it kind of reveals some even more disappointing truths. So we see that the what I have underlined here in red, that when rental costs are equal to 80% of average market rent, they're typically considered affordable. Um, and then we look at the chart. So the City of Toronto provides a really lengthy chart that goes through what 80% of average market rent is for many different types of rental units. And so let's look at the one bedroom apartment. So we see 80% of the average market rent right now for a one bedroom apartment is $1,372. So we know the City of Toronto is considering $1,372 for a one bedroom monthly affordable. Now, that's fine, but if we think about people who are receiving OW or ODSP, who are living in deep poverty, we know that that is far from affordable because we know that the most amount that somebody on OW monthly could receive for a shelter benefit is $390. We know the most amount somebody could afford on ODSP for their shelter benefit as $582. So those numbers come nowhere near 1,372. They don't even come near 80% of a dwelling room in what would be like a rooming house of over $900. So sometimes the City of Toronto is going to be using the term affordable, but I think we always need to be questioning, is it actually affordable? Is it actually affordable for our clients who are receiving social assistance, who are on very low income? I also encourage you to think about affordable. When people are talking about affordable housing, always think back to 30% of um, of the household income for that rental unit. When you hear somebody using the term affordable housing, you're going to need to know much more about the context of who's using it, what they mean by it, why are they using it, before we know if what they're actually talking about is housing that actually is affordable. So I want to pause now. Another turn for folks to throw some ideas in the chat of what are terms that you hear used to describe different forms of affordable housing. Okay, we've got sustainable, subsidized, yep. Any other words you might hear government officials talk about what is affordable housing, or nonprofits talk about what is affordable housing? Rent geared to income housing, that's good. City housing. Okay, we've got the term core housing need. We can talk about that one later. Low income housing, yeah. Okay, these are great examples of words. And I know that when many people filled in the registration for today, they were able to fill in some terms that they were hoping we were going to talk about. And so many of these terms are terms that that were put on that form. So let's jump into some examples of talking about affordable housing. So the main one that I saw mentioned a couple times is subsidized housing. And apologies, I'm just getting over a cold, so I'm just going to take a quick pause here. So subsidized housing is the most common type of housing that we see in the affordable housing category in Toronto. It's also, as somebody in the chat mentioned, referred to as rent geared to income housing or RGI housing. In the housing world, RGI is a very commonly used acronym. So I would say make sure you understand what that is. Rent geared to income just means that the rent that a tenant is being charged is calculated based on whatever their income is. So some really big providers of RGI housing in Toronto include Toronto Community Housing Corporation, or TCHC, which is another acronym you'll likely hear, or Toronto Seniors Housing Corporation. TCHC uses the affordable calculation that we were talking about a couple minutes ago, calculating rent based on 30% of a household's annual income. And so, as many of you probably know, tenants who live in RGI housing are required to submit paperwork every year declaring who lives in the rental unit and what the income is for everybody in the rental unit so that their rent can be properly calculated. This is often very cumbersome work for tenants. They have to get their notices of assessment or their T4s or other documents. They need to fill in many forms every year. Now, although it's very cumbersome, it's very important that this paperwork gets filled in and submitted on time every year. If a tenant doesn't submit their annual review paperwork, they could lose access to their subsidized housing, which could have a really disastrous effect on a family. So if you're assisting tenants with submitting their annual review paperwork, please know that it's a very essential part of maintaining access to safe, affordable housing. Toronto Seniors Housing Corporation follows the same model as TCHC in that they calculate rent as 30% of a household's income. They provide housing for those who are over the age of 59. Co-op housing is another example of subsidized housing. Co-op housing is when a nonprofit housing cooperative owns a property and it is operated by the people who live in it. So the people who live in co-ops are considered members, not tenants. Each co-op is governed by a board of directors made up of members who are elected by other members. An example of a housing co-op is Duncan Mills. I have the image up here on the screen. This is a co-op in my catchment area for the Willowdale Clinic. It's called Duncan Mills. It's at 2040 Don Mills Road. Now, on the screen, I also have the second to last point that says portable housing benefits. So this is probably a term that you hear your clients talk about. And I wanted to include it under subsidized housing, though it's slightly different from rent geared to income housing. It is still subsidized housing. So some tenants who live in a private rental unit, owned and run by a private landlord, they might receive a subsidy for their rent, which means that the costs of their housing are subsidized, though the rental unit itself is not a subsidized unit. So when you're living in TCHC, your apartment is subsidized, but when you're receiving a portable housing benefit, your unit is not subsidized, but the rent that you pay wherever you live is subsidized. It's called a portable housing benefit. The amount of the subsidy will differ depending on the amount of rent being charged by the private landlord and depending on the household's income. These types of portable housing benefits are meant to kind of fill a gap between what a percentage of an income on rent would be, or fill the gap between what the household has to spend and what a set percentage of the income on rent would be. So an example of a portable housing benefit is COB. Maybe this is something that folks here have seen their clients have access to. It's the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. And so this is a monthly benefit. It's a portable housing benefit, so it goes along with tenants no matter where they live. It pays a portion of their rent to hopefully make their rent more affordable for that family or individual. The final note on this screen is the term social housing. So sometimes we hear these terms kind of thrown around together, subsidized housing, public housing, low-income housing, social housing. Social housing is kind of just a more umbrella term that is used to describe affordable housing that is provided by government or nonprofits. And so rent geared to income housing through TCHC or Toronto Seniors Housing or co-op housing is captured under social housing, but a portable housing benefit or a housing rental subsidy isn't really considered social housing. It's more so just a benefit that attaches to a family. On this slide, I have two terms side by side that I want to talk about, transitional housing and supportive housing. And these are on the same slide because they're sometimes kind of overlapping in their definitions of what type of housing this is. So transitional housing is meant to help individuals transition from some form of unstable housing into permanent and independent living. So unstable housing could be homelessness, or it could also be things such as incarceration or hospital care. And transitional housing, it has an end goal in mind. The end goal is to get the tenant living in independent living, whatever is next. It's not meant to be forever housing. It's kind of an in-between measure. Whereas supportive housing, it might actually be an example of transitional housing, or it could be a permanent type of housing for somebody without an expiry date. So supportive housing could be helpful for people who require extra support due to disabilities, due to addictions, mental health challenges. And so the two images that I have on the screen, Loft Community Services first. This is an agency that provides actually both transitional and supportive housing to people with a variety of needs, as I just outlined. Could be due to disabilities, could be due to complex mental health challenges or addictions, or people transitioning out of homelessness. And then NAMARES is an organization that provides support for Indigenous men who are experiencing homelessness. NAMARES provides transitional housing to men who are transitioning out of homelessness, but they also provide supportive permanent housing for the same population. So both of these organizations kind of do both for different populations. So I want to pause here. I've been seeing some things come in on the chat, and I just want to um, pause before we move on to kind of part two of this presentation is talking about other housing terms to know, less about affordable housing and more about just tenancies in general. Are there any specific questions about transitional housing, supportive housing, subsidized housing, or affordable housing in general that maybe would be helpful for us to address right now before we move on? There will be a chance for a more in-depth Q&A after, but I just want to provide the chance to pause right now before we move on to the next section.
So Rebecca, there's a question here in the chat. John asked, the COB people cannot apply for. COHB, Canada Ontario Housing Benefit.
Yeah, so the COHB, Canada Ontario Housing Benefit, was the portable housing benefit that I was talking about. Applications for COB open and close depending on the time of year, depending on what funding is available, depending on how many applications have been received. Currently, it's closed, so there's no way to apply for the COB benefit. There might be some organizations that are specific COB kind of referral or application partners who might be able to gain access for individuals to COB. I'm not aware of what those are. There's not a publicly available list anywhere for that. What I would recommend is just checking the City of Toronto website. They have a page on COB. Right now, the page indicates that applications are closed. I imagine if it were to open in the future, it would be announced on that page. And just the question about if single people can apply for COB. Yeah, COB is available for families, for individuals. It's really just a calculation of if you meet the eligibility around income and the need for affordable housing based on your low income.
Also, Rebecca, another question from Milton from chat. He said, I guess my question would be, how can we ensure that the language used to define affordable or equitable housing actually reflects the lived experience of newcomers and low-income residents, especially when income stress and the cultural needs vary so widely?
I mean, that's a pretty big question. I think it's always tough for language to properly reflect the experiences of ourselves, of our clients. And so I mean, what I would suggest is maybe not using terms like affordable or adequate housing without context, and to always provide a deeper explanation of what you mean when you're saying that term. So it's affordable for people on ODSP, or it's affordable for people who receive Ontario Works. It's affordable for people who are making less than X amount of money per year. We know affordable means such different things for different people, so I think we can always kind of tack on another line to what we mean by affordable. Affordable for who? If when we're talking about things being affordable for those living on the lowest of income, so I would say those receiving Ontario Works as their main source of income, we want to say that. We want to say what we mean when we're saying something is affordable. I mean, I would also encourage maybe others on this webinar could to think about that and to maybe later when we're talking about our Q&A to come up with ideas about how they like to talk about affordable or adequate housing as it relates to their clients or as it relates to a population that you're familiar with. I'm sure there are other ideas in the room. And then I see another question here about RGI having extremely long wait lists. So we're actually going to get into that in a couple of minutes. And there's a question about what programs are available for those who need more immediate support. I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to explain some examples of ways in which you can essentially expedite your RGI housing application. Again, I just want to reiterate that my role today is not to provide a list of resources for you guys about what is available for your clients. I know there will be future presentations that are going to focus more on that. Today, we're really talking about the language and making sure we're understanding the language and the context that we're in when we're providing housing services to individuals in Toronto. So maybe with that, we can roll on to the next section of the presentation which is about other housing terms to know. So we've talked about affordable. Affordability is often what government is talking about, what nonprofits are talking about, what, any kind of group that's concerned with the social well-being of people in Toronto is talking about is affordable housing. So it's very important that we understand that context. But there's a bunch of other terms that are also related that are really important for your clients to know about and for you to know about so that when you're talking to your clients about them, you can feel confident in what you're advising them. And maybe you can also feel confident knowing when you need to advise that they get legal advice. So I first want to talk about the issue of rent control. The middle two terms here, the centralized waiting list and priority access to RGI housing, they deal with the wait list that somebody just posted a question about, that really lengthy wait list for affordable housing. And then the final term here is the landlord and tenant board, which is kind of my wheelhouse. This is where I do most of my work. And it's kind of the legal forum in which landlord and tenant matters get dealt with in Ontario. So first, let's talk about rent control. Rent control, we will often hear people talking about it as the rules around how often and by how much landlords can increase rent for tenants. So currently in Ontario, we have this awful situation called vacancy decontrol. Vacancy decontrol means that landlords are allowed to charge any amount of rent that they want when a tenant first moves into a rental unit. Now, the flip side of vacancy decontrol that a lot of housing advocates are asking for is something called vacancy control. This would put limits on how much a landlord can increase rent in between tenants. So this is important because we know that currently there's an incentive for landlords to evict long-term tenants. If you have been living in a rental unit for 30 years, your rent has only been able to be increased each year by the guideline amount, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment. And so your rent is likely well below market rent. If you are a long-term tenant, that means that your landlord isn't making a lot of money off of you. And if they were to evict you, they could kick you out, they could get a new tenant in, and they could increase the rent that they charge the new tenant by however much they want. So they could double it, they could triple it, they could quadruple it. There's no limit on how much they could increase the rent. And so landlords, as we know, are mainly businesses. Landlords, their focus is making a profit, is making money. And so they're concerned with how can they maximize their profits. And unfortunately, that means oftentimes that there's an incentive for them to try and kick out long-term tenants. So having vacancy control would disincentivize those types of evictions, of getting long-term tenants out. So there is a lot of there's a lot of advocacy work right now around trying to get the province to implement vacancy control, because the current state of things with vacancy decontrol leaves a lot of incentives for landlords to kick out long-term tenants. So that's kind of the context. Let's come back now to rent control. So we know that landlords can increase it by however much they want in between tenants. But after a tenant moves in, that's when the rules start to apply. That's when rent control applies. So first, a landlord must wait at least 12 months before raising the rent after a tenant has moved in. And then the landlord must also wait 12 more months. They can only increase the rent once a year. So if you've got a client and you keep hearing about their landlord increasing their rent and it seems like it's happening more than once every 12 months, tell your client to get legal advice because their landlord is likely doing something illegal. When the landlord increases the rent every 12 months, in most cases, they can only increase it by what's called the guideline amount. And so I have a chart right here on the right of the slide that shows the percentage that the government has set for the last 5 years, 6 years, showing what amount landlords are allowed to increase rent by. Every year, the government comes out with a percentage of what landlords are allowed to increase rent by. We've been in a slump of 2.5% for the last 3 years. So we know for this year, landlords are only allowed to increase rent by 2.5%. Unfortunately, though, some units are not covered by rent control. And you'll remember at the start of my presentation, I was talking about how this housing crisis that we're in is the result of government policy decisions. This right here is a perfect example of a government decision that has led to a deepened housing crisis in Ontario. So Premier Doug Ford, when he came into power, he removed rent control on rental units that were built after November 15th, 2018. So if a tenant lives in a rental unit that was not lived in or rented before November 15th, 2018, their landlord can increase the rent by however much they want every year. They are not bound by this guideline amount. If you have a client who's got a really big rent increase, they're trying to figure out if they should, if they should stay living in their apartment or if they should move out and try and find somewhere more affordable, and it looks like the increase is more than approximately 2.5%, you should encourage them to get legal advice. They may or they may not be covered by rent control, but it's really important that tenants check that and check to see if they are covered by the rules to know if their landlord is properly complying with those rules. There's also another scheme of rent increases called above guideline increase or AGI. You might see this or hear this. Some people call them AGIs. Above guideline increases are special rules that landlords have that they can increase rent by more than the guideline amount if they apply to the landlord and tenant board and get special permission. It has to be done with specific parameters about why they're asking for the increase. It typically is done when landlords are doing large scale kind of renovations on a property. But there are rules around above guideline increases. There's rules around how and when tenants have to pay it, how much it can be, limits on how much and how long the above guideline increase can take effect for. So again, if you've got a client who's dealing with an above guideline increase or they've got an increase that's just seeming astronomical, recommend that they get legal advice so that we can go over that with them to make sure that it is legal. The next term that I want to talk about is really important. I think we're going to probably spend some time here talking about this next section. It's the centralized waiting list. So this refers to the essentially the affordable housing wait list. People call it the affordable housing wait list, maybe the TCHC wait list, I hear people say. It's the list of names of people who are waiting for rent geared to income housing. Once an individual submits an application to the centralized waitlist, it typically will take about a year for them to hear back about their application. They'll get a letter, they'll get some kind of notification saying, okay, your application has been processed, you're on the list. The wait time after that is quite long. Um, I want to get to this question that I have in yellow in a second, but before we get to that, I just want to explain that I think this was identified in some of the questions people raised that they wanted to have talked about in this presentation today about the online application process. So people can submit an application for rent geared to income housing through the My Access to Housing TO. It's an online portal. They have to create an account, they submit their application, and this portal is where they manage their application, provide any supporting updated documents. And once you're on this waitlist, once you've submitted your application for RGI housing, typically it's first come, first served, meaning if you're at the top of the list, you're going to get a place first, but you have to wait till your name reaches the top of the list. But there are some exceptions, and I'm going to go into those exceptions about how you can get priority access for subsidized housing on the next slide. But before I get there, I want to throw it back to you guys and see if anybody has an idea about what the average wait time is for RGI housing in Toronto. Once you get on the wait list, how long are people waiting? Okay, I'm seeing around 10 years. We got 8 to 10, 12, 10, 10 to 15. Somebody says 4 years, which is um, very, I would say, aspirational. That would be great if the wait list was that short. But I think everybody here sounds like you've been doing this work for a while and sounds like you've got a good sense of how long it is. So the average wait time as of last year was about 10 years in Toronto. But we all know that we sometimes speak to tenants who are waiting closer to 15 years before an offer for subsidized housing is given to them or their family. I think it depends on the region. It depends on how many bedrooms, like how big is the unit that you're waiting for. Um, I wanted to give just some other numbers so that people are aware. Like we know that the situation is bad in Toronto. We see that every day in our work. But I also just want to contextualize that it's bad everywhere. These issues of access to affordable housing are bad everywhere. So the Durham region as of last year had about a 15 to 20 year wait list in Peel housing, so Peel subsidized housing, up to 20 years you could be waiting. I think that's similar to Toronto. Some folks are waiting much closer to 20 rather than 10 years. Ottawa's a bit better. They've got about a 4 to 8 year wait list before you can get into subsidized housing there. So given these numbers, we obviously know that the supply of affordable housing is deeply inadequate to meet the needs of those requiring the housing. And I think maybe I just want to pause here also that um, this can be especially shocking for newcomers to Canada, newcomers to Toronto, who maybe were given the impression that the story would be different and that there wouldn't be this much of a wait. And I imagine that many of you in your work have to be the ones to break the news to people about how inadequate our affordable housing stock is for people in Toronto. Oftentimes people don't realize just how bad it is. They might realize it's a couple year wait, but they don't realize that it could be 20 years before you get an affordable home. Okay, so given these lengthy wait times that we just talked about, that we know exist for people and have existed for years, I mean, these lengthy wait lists are not new. There have been years-long wait lists for decades. There are some situations where applications could be expedited. I'm going to go through them. I would say some of them are more common and some of them typically move quicker than other expedited categories, but we can go through them together, and I'm happy to hear from others if they have more experience with some of these categories. So the first example is the most common type of expedited application that I see. This is another acronym, so it's called the Special Priority Program, or SPP. If you see somebody who has SPP housing or SPP RGI housing, you know that they have been given priority access to RGI housing because they are a survivor of some type of domestic abuse or human trafficking. And so to qualify for this category, the household needs to either, or an individual needs to either be living with or have lived with an individual who is abusive or is sponsoring an abused member as an immigrant, or you need to have a member of your household who is being or has been trafficked. So in order to qualify under the special priority program, there's specific documents and paperwork that needs to be submitted along with the application for RGI housing. There are rules around who can fill in that paperwork, what type of certifications they need to have, and that type of thing. It can't just be that somebody declares they are a victim of abuse and they get priority access. There are some hoops they need to jump through. And so I know that there are individuals at housing help centers who specifically help with these types of applications. Maybe some folks are on this call right now. But there are ways in which you can essentially strengthen an application if you're applying under the special priority program to make sure that you're jumping through the hoops properly. The second category of priority access to subsidized housing is households of that already live in subsidized units who need to move to a smaller unit. So a term you might hear that is good to know is the term overhoused. So overhoused refers to a rental unit where there are too few people in too large of a unit. So an example of this might be maybe a mom and her two children moved into a three-bedroom RGI housing unit when the kids were young. They lived in that unit for many years. The kids grew up, they moved out. Mom is still living in a three-bedroom unit now alone. So mom would be considered overhoused. And Toronto Community Housing and other RGI housing providers don't like it when people are overhoused for obvious reasons, because they want to make sure that a family in need that needs a three-bedroom unit that's on the wait list can have access to that bigger unit. And so, in order to allow them to have access to that bigger unit, they need to move mom into a smaller unit. And so, if you're somebody who lives in a subsidized unit, you're being told that you're overhoused and you need to move to a smaller unit, it's going to be expedited. You're going to be moved quickly to a different unit, and you need to accept whatever smaller unit is offered to you, or else you could risk losing access to subsidized housing altogether. Number three is terminally ill applicants. And so, in order to qualify for priority access to subsidized housing under this category, you need to make sure that you've provided medical documentation that confirms that you have a life expectancy of less than 2 years. Number four is households that are exiting supportive housing. So we can recall we spoke about supportive housing a few minutes ago. That's where you might be somebody who's living in a subsidized unit that requires extra special support of some type. There are many different RGI buildings around the city that operate as supportive housing that not only provide RGI housing, they provide in-house supports to those who live in that building. And so if for whatever reason a tenant no longer requires those supports and would like to live fully independently, then they can move to a different RGI unit. They'll be expedited on the list to move to a different unit without that support. Number five is explanatory applicants who are experiencing homelessness. If an individual is currently homeless, they have to connect with a housing worker or a shelter worker to seek to access priority access if they've already submitted an RGI housing application. Or when they are initially submitting their RGI housing application, they need to declare that they are experiencing homelessness. Maybe there are folks in the room here who can speak to this better than I can, and I would love to hear from you if you can. I haven't seen this category move particularly quickly for people. There are many, many people in Toronto that are experiencing homelessness that are on the RGI wait list, and I haven't seen them, be quickly funneled into an RGI unit. I don't know what the triaging process is like for the centralized waiting list when people declare that they are homeless. But if others in the room know more about that, I would love to hear from you. Number six is also very self-explanatory. So if somebody is 16 or 17 years old and they're the head of a household, then they can get an expedited access to RGI housing. And then the final category is interesting. It's for individuals who are Indigenous. So in order to be eligible under this category, at least 50% of household members must be Indigenous. It's not the City of Toronto. It's a completely independent organization that conducts eligibility verification for the priority on behalf of the City of Toronto. And they'll need to provide proof of Indigenous identity through a status card or a supportive letter from a band or a First Nation or an Inuit government organization. Okay, so this is the final kind of term that we're going to talk about before we head into the final section of the presentation. And like I said before, the Landlord and Tenant Board, this is really my wheelhouse. So if folks have any detailed questions about the LTB, I'm happy to answer them. The LTB is an administrative tribunal that deals with tenancy matters in Ontario. So what I mean by administrative tribunal is it's kind of like a court. It's a bit more relaxed, But the people who make decisions at the landlord and tenant board, they are similar to judges, but they're called adjudicators. They make decisions about tenancy matters, legal cases that are before them. It is very, very important for tenants to get legal advice if they have any paperwork from the landlord and tenant board. So if you've got a client and they have anything with this logo on it, essentially, any notice of hearing, any document telling them about how to log into an online portal to access documents, any paperwork about how to request an accommodation at the landlord and tenant board, that means that they probably have a hearing and they probably need to get some legal advice about what to do. It is so much easier to assist people with their legal issues if they come to me or if they come to my office early on. It is very, very difficult to help people solve their legal issues when they're coming to me the night before their hearing or even a week before their hearing. We want as much lead up time as possible. So if your clients have paperwork or if they're talking about a hearing at the LTB, ask them, have you received legal advice? Have you met with somebody at a community legal clinic? If they haven't, give them our phone number or give them the Legal Aid Ontario phone number so that they can get connected with their local legal clinic to receive legal advice. And the reason why this is so important is because the landlord and tenant board it plays an essential role in evictions in Ontario. So I want to just briefly talk through the eviction process in Ontario. Step one is that a landlord needs to serve tenants with a special type of notice. It's called a notice of termination. It's from the landlord and tenant board. Step two is a landlord files a case at the landlord and tenant board based on that notice of termination they served on the tenant. Step three is a hearing happens at the landlord and tenant board. And the hearing is the tenant's only chance to present their arguments about why they shouldn't be evicted. So it is very important that tenants attend their hearings. It is really difficult to appeal or request a review of a decision from the landlord and tenant board. Following a hearing at the landlord and tenant board, the LTB will issue an order, which is the legally binding decision that the tenant needs to abide by about whether they're being evicted or not. If the order allows eviction, then the landlord can take that document, that legally binding order, file it with a place called the sheriff, and the sheriff will come and evict the tenant. So the LTB plays an essential role in evictions in Ontario. The hearing that happens at the LTB is the most important chance for the tenant to present their case about why they shouldn't lose their housing. In cases of RGI housing, why they shouldn't lose their subsidized housing, because when you're evicted from subsidized housing, it's nearly impossible to ever get back into subsidized housing. So I really just want to underscore that if you've got clients with LTB documents, tell them to get legal advice. If you know they have a hearing and they're not understanding how serious the hearing is, you really want to make sure they're getting legal advice and you're encouraging them to attend that hearing. Because if they don't and they're evicted, it's nearly impossible to challenge that decision after that point. Okay, so I want to end off here with three kind of hot topics in housing law for all of you to kind of keep on your on I guess on your desk so that if you see these words coming up, you know what's going on. First is about dem evictions, and I'll talk to you about what dem evictions and rent evictions number two are. And the third is about a maximum heating bylaw, which is really exciting. I have some new news about that I just learned of today. So first of all, let's talk about dem evictions. So dem evictions is like a colloquial term that we use to describe when a landlord is evicting a tenant because they want to demolish a rental unit. And there's a legal process in place in Ontario that allows landlords to do this. They need to follow certain steps, but they are allowed to evict tenants if they want to demolish a rental unit or a building. Now, the difficult thing here is that the stock of affordable rental buildings in Toronto is being destroyed at a much faster rate than they're being built. Now, I want to pause here because I want to explain one term that's in point two here. I have the term purpose-built rental. And this is a term that you'll often hear people in government talk about solutions to the affordable housing crisis is we need more purpose-built rentals. Purpose-built rentals just refers to buildings that were meant to be rented. It's an important distinction because we're oftentimes seeing buildings such as condo buildings being built, and individual owners will buy condo units and will rent them out. However, the building itself isn't meant to be a rental. And so it's really up to the owners of the condos to determine whether or not they want to make rental units available. Purpose-built rentals are really important because that's going to expand the stock of rental units in Toronto or in the province. And so when it comes to dem evictions, we know that a lot of affordable, i.e., old buildings that are meant for renting, so old apartment buildings, are being demolished way quicker than new ones are being built to replace them. Now, I know I have the title as Dem Evictions Bylaw. It's not really a bylaw that I'm talking about here. It's more so policy reform that the City of Toronto is currently engaging in. And there's been some really exciting advocacy around dem evictions. So just a couple of months ago in April, or just about a month ago, the City of Toronto was reviewing their rental replacement policy. So this policy outlines what developers are responsible for versus what tenants are entitled to when a dem eviction occurs. When a developer comes in to demolish an old building and build something new in its place. There's a group called No Dem Evictions that I would encourage everybody here to check out and make sure you're aware of and keeping up to date on what they're doing. They're a group of tenant associations from across the province. No Dem Evictions, I believe it's nodemevictions.com or .ca, you can look them up. They're advocating for increased tenant protections when it comes to dem evictions in terms of information, in terms of compensation, in terms of access to other housing. And so some of the recommendations that they came to City Council with were accepted when the City of Toronto was going through this rental replacement policy. So you can look up those things in more detail if you're interested. But it's just exciting to know that there is really, really great advocacy occurring right now around what rights tenants have when their old stock housing is being demolished, especially as we're in a state where we know that there's not affordable housing. We know that there's vacancy decontrol. There are so many issues that are making it really hard for long-term tenants to be thrust into the housing market. And so better protections in situations where houses are being demolished is really important. Similarly, there's something called renovictions, and you can probably guess what it means. It's when a landlord evicts a tenant in order to complete renovations on a rental unit or in a building that contains a rental unit. There's a legal process that landlords must follow in order to evict somebody, in order to renovict somebody. Um, the renovations that are being done are required to be extensive enough that the unit must be vacant. And we sometimes see landlords trying to get around this by claiming that renovations they want to do are so extreme that tenants must move out. But in reality, they're not actually that severe, and tenants are able to stay living in their home. Um, in November, after months and months and months of really strong advocacy by folks within the legal clinic system, Toronto City Council adopted a rental renovation license bylaw that is meant to curb bad faith evictions and try to prevent renovictions. So this is fantastic. This comes after several other jurisdictions across Canada already have this type of bylaw in place and have seen this have a really positive effect on people being renovicted. So decreasing how often renovictions are happening and increasing things like compensation, access to information, access to new housing when people are being renovicted. This bylaw hasn't yet come into place. It will come into place in July, at the end of July of this year. So I know we're too early on. We're not yet going to see the effects of this bylaw, but it's exciting, and I would encourage you to keep up to date on it. I imagine that there will be many housing advocates that are keeping a close eye on what effect this bylaw is happening on how many rent evictions are happening throughout Toronto once the license has been in place for a while, probably for several months before we see some kind of change. Finally, very exciting is some work around a maximum heat bylaw. So for um, many of you likely know that the City of Toronto currently has rules around minimum heating. So we know that in the winter, rental units must be at least 21 degrees Celsius between October 1st and May 15th every single year. If a tenant's landlord is not properly heating their unit, the tenant can call the City of Toronto, get a bylaw inspector to come out and order that their landlord increase the heat. But unfortunately, there's not equivalent rules for the summer. And there's been a lot of advocacy requesting the city or requesting the province broadly to increase rules, to implement rules around how warm a rental unit can be. Now, it might be obvious, but this is important for elderly individuals. This is important for people who live in high-rise apartment buildings where there isn't really good air circulation. This is important for people who have health conditions where their health condition is exacerbated by being overheated by heat. So there's a group called the Low Income Energy Network. If you're not familiar with them, I would say look them up. Them and a coalition of other groups have been advocating for a maximum heat bylaw in Toronto, suggesting that similar to how a landlord cannot let a unit drop below 21 degrees in the winter, they're saying that a unit should not be hotter than 26 degrees in the summer. The bylaw hasn't yet come into force. There's not yet any rules that exist around this, but I just learned of something today that I wanted to share with you. We can end on this. That the City of Toronto is piloting a program this year, this summer, a portable air conditioning project. And so it's meant for Toronto residents who are 65 or older, who are living in an apartment, who are low income, and who have a health related need related to air conditioning. They don't need to provide a doctor's note. They just need to self-declare that they have a health condition that relates to needing air conditioning. They can apply for a a portable air conditioning unit that will be provided to them over the summer. I believe it's going to be a lottery system. So, and there's a limited number of portable air conditioning units. So I don't know how many there are. I don't know if the number of air conditioning units will be able to meet the demand. However, it's really, really important that as many people as possible who need air conditioning apply for this program. And that's to demonstrate to the city the need for this type of support for seniors, especially. Even if it means that not everybody's going to get the air conditioning unit, it's going to be helpful for the city to see how dire situations are, how important it is for people in apartment buildings who are elderly, who have health related needs concerning air conditioning to have access to cooling. And so ideally, this would also help support the implementation of a maximum heat bylaw going forward if the city sees a really high demand for this type of a program. So I would recommend you check it out. The link is on the screen there, toronto.ca/AC program. If you have clients who are eligible, I would recommend that you apply on their behalf for this program. So that's all I have in terms of the content. I know we still have some time here, and I want to check in to see if there are questions from anybody about any of the content that I covered kind of in the second half of the presentations.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for the very informative session. Thank you. Yeah, I know, it is so hard, not easy to unpack so many key terms, right? In about 1 hour. So thank you for your effort that you put in. So everybody, now I think it's your time to ask question to Rebecca. Yeah. Rebecca, there's a question from the chat. Rachel asks, is there any information that you could provide briefly about the rent bank?
Yeah, sure. So the Rent Bank, for those who don't know, is a program that's available for tenants in Toronto who owe rent. Well, there's kind of two purposes. One is if they owe rent arrears to their landlord. So rent arrears is the money that you owe when you've fallen behind on rent and you're maybe facing eviction. Another way in which Rent Bank is helpful is to help people put down first and last month's rent deposit at a new apartment if they're looking to move, but they don't have enough money to put down a deposit. So, Rent Bank, like I said, there's it's a program that's available for these two purposes. There's a limit on how much money they can typically provide annually for a person. I believe that there's a limit on only once every 12 months somebody can access funding through Rent Bank. And I believe there's also eligibility around minimum or sorry, maximum income that a household can make before they're not no longer eligible for rent bank. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know this can be found on the city website. So there's eligibility criteria. A tenant can apply. And like I said, it can mainly help with paying off rent arrears to avoid eviction or helping them get set up at a new place to put down a deposit. I see there's also a question about asking for the free fast contact to deal with the LTB. I wish that that existed. I mean, if anybody has one, please share it with me. I know the LTB is notoriously difficult to deal with, and as somebody who deals with them regularly, I know how painful it is. There's a general phone line that you can call if somebody is looking for kind of general legal information. And so you can find that on the LTB website. I would recommend calling early in the day. The later on in the day you call, the more likely you're going to have to wait on hold before you get through to somebody. And then the general email is just ltb@ontario.ca. It might take them a couple weeks to respond, but they typically do respond. But unfortunately, I don't have any kind of hack for getting in touch with the LTB.
Also, Rebecca, that's a question earlier from Needy. Needy asked, how do you explain affordable housing to a newcomer who has just come to Canada without sharing a lot of details?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a tough question because I guess it depends on what type of affordable housing you're describing to the newcomer. I think that it's best to talk about RGI housing or subsidized housing, and so you can just simply explain that in Toronto there is housing that is provided by the government or nonprofits where the rent that you are going to be charged just depends on how much money you make. So if you're not making much money or if you're receiving government benefits, your rent is going to be very low. If you start making more money, your rent will increase. So you can just explain the relationship between rent and income, I would say is the most useful way to describe that for people.
Thanks, Rebecca. There's no question in the chat box. So I would encourage everyone on the meeting, you can unmute yourself, you can ask question. Yeah. Oh, there's a question. Rolla.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I
Yeah,
see the question from Rolla. So
yeah.
similar to Rent Bank, a question about Epic. So for those who don't know, Epic is a really good program to know about. It's called Eviction Prevention in the Community. It's similar to Rent Bank in that it helps people who owe money to their landlord and who are facing eviction because of that. It can help people pay off that money. But Epic is also more than that. They have case managers. They can help people with budgeting. They can I've heard of them providing like grocery gift cards to people, helping with communication with somebody's OW or ODSP worker if they're having issues getting rent paid directly from OW or ODSP to their landlord. So Epic is a really good program because it provides not only that financial support to people who are facing eviction because they owe money to their landlord, but also some of the other types of supports that they might need. Epic, though, is a bit harder to access than Rent Bank. Rent Bank, anybody can apply. You can call 311 and get an application submitted to Rent Bank through the City of Toronto. Epic, you need a referral partner. So my office, Willowdale Community Legal Services, we are a referral partner to Epic. And so if I speak with a tenant and it looks like Epic could be helpful for them, then I can make the referral on their behalf. Some of the organizations you work with might also be referral partners, but that's the one thing about Epic is it's a bit harder to get in touch with. And I don't see any other questions coming up, but I just remembered there were some questions. I saw lots of questions on the registration sheet that were great and that hopefully were answered in this presentation. But there was one term that somebody asked about. They were asking about month-to-month tenancies and kind of just an explanation about what that means. And so I know we have a couple of minutes now, so just briefly for those who are kind of curious about the different types of tenancies that exist in Ontario, there's two main types of tenancies. There's a fixed term tenancy, and then there's month-to-month tenancies. So a fixed term tenancy is when a tenant has an agreement with a landlord that they are going to rent a rental unit for a certain period of time. Typically in Toronto, what we see are people typically will sign a 12-month lease agreement when they first move into a rental unit, and that's considered a fixed term lease for 12 months. Once the 12 months are over, the tenant does not need to move out because we have this really wonderful concept in Ontario called security of tenure, which means that tenants are allowed to keep living in their rental unit even after a fixed term lease ends, as long as there's no legal basis for them to be evicted. And so that means that even if the tenant doesn't sign a new lease agreement or doesn't enter into any new kind of lease agreement with their landlord, their tenancy will automatically turn into a month-to-month or a monthly tenancy after the fixed term is over. There are slightly different rules around what type of notice the tenant would need to give when if they want to move out of a tenancy in a fixed term tenancy versus month-to-month tenancy. But it just means that no longer are you on a fixed term. No longer is there a set end date to the tenancy. It can go on until the end of time, or it should go on until the end of time, unless something legally changes, meaning that you should be evicted, or unless you want to move out. And I think there will be other presentations that might get more into the kind of nitty-gritty of legal terms and legal rights and responsibilities. But I just wanted to make sure that that was covered. And so I see a question saying that when the tenancy turns to month, what happens to notice period when someone wants to move out? So if you're on a month-to-month tenancy and you want to move out, you need to give your landlord at least 60 days notice that you want to move out. And you need to move out on a date that is the end of a rental period. So that means that if you pay your rent on the first of every month, as most people do, then the end of a rental period would be the final day of a month. You can't give your landlord notice right now on May 27th that you want to move out on July 27th. Yes, you'd be giving them 60 days notice, but you also need to make sure that the date you're going to move out is the final date of a rental period. So right now, on May 27th, the earliest time that a tenant could give their landlord notice that they want to move out is July 31st, because that's at least 60 days away, and that's the end of a rental period. So when you're on month to month, it just means the most important thing is giving 60 days. Most people don't want to move out partway through a rental period because when they sign a new lease, it's probably going to be for the first of the month somewhere else. But it's mainly just important that you're giving them 60 days notice. Okay. Thank you for all of these questions, and thank you for the engagement with the questions that I was asking. It was obvious that folks here know a lot about RGI housing, have thought about affordability of housing, and so I hope that I was still able to give some new or some helpful additional information for folks here.